What is up, everybody? I'm No Lux Given here with your afternoon snap, and today we've got a brand new featured location, Rickety Bridge. This deck has a ton of fun ways to take advantage of the location, so I'm gonna go ahead and snap on turn 2. We've got Electro, Bucky Barnes, Dr. Octopus, and so much more. We're gonna look at all of it. I'm gonna cover 9 games in today's video that feature Rickety Bridge in a variety of different ways, and even a few that don't have the bridge, just for fun. But this one is going to be a pretty straightforward, I would say this is like the main combo that the deck tries to do. So turn 2, my opponent is going to play a Scorpion. Don't really care about that. I care mostly about the abilities on my cards, not really the amount of power that they have. In turn 3, we're going to play an Electro onto that Rickety Bridge. Now, it isn't actually super important that we blow up Electro immediately, but what is cool here is we blow up my opponent's Scorpion, which makes some more room on the bridge for me to drag out my opponent's entire hand with Dr. Octopus. And this is just a really good, I would say, like, disruptive element to the deck. Is now my opponent has 4 cards rather, from their hand that they're not going to be able to play. Juggernaut is actually going to do something funny here, knock my Dr. Octopus over into Asgard. So now we tie that location and deny my opponent card draw. We're briefly losing it here because of Mr. Fantastic, though that's going to get blown up by the Rickety Bridge before Asgard activates. So we now destroyed my opponent's entire hand, and we made it so that they don't get to draw additional cards here. And then we draw the G-Man, Galactus. This is the main part of the deck. You blow up everything that's on the Rickety Bridge, then you blow up anything that isn't on the Rickety Bridge, and hopefully you are able to take better advantage of it than your opponent is able to do. I did want to say a few other ways that this game could have gone. Say we didn't draw Galactus. If Mojo World also wasn't one of the locations this game, one of the game plans is just Doc Ock onto the bridge, blow up a bunch of power worth of stuff, and then you and your opponent are going to tie the bridge because nobody can add cards to that location without them blowing up, and then you win one of the locations with Knull, and that's typically enough to just allow you to win the game on differential. There's one other thing that I wanted to talk about as well. Typically, the way that you're going to win the Rickety Bridge is with Bucky Barnes on the final turn, and then everything else is just going to be destroyed, and your opponent kind of has to stay in it here because they might be thinking, well, I think this game's just going to be a tie, so I'm going to stick around, potentially lose 4 cubes, but probably just tie the game, and then Bucky Barnes gets to surprise them. I'm also playing Enchantress to blow up potential armors and free up the bridge so that way Bucky Barnes can take over and win it for you. Here's another fun one against the same opponent, actually, though this time we're going to play Electro into Isle of Silence, because why not? It's here. So we'll take advantage of that, and then turn 4, we are again going to play Dr. Octopus onto the Rickety Bridge, just such a powerful, disruptive element, so I'm going to go ahead and snap. I will note that this game was actually the first one I played against Tyler here. I just put them out of order. I thought that the other one was better to open this video up with, but this was also a fun game for actually a totally different reason, because Tyler winds up rhinoing to ruin the featured location. Boo! Boo! You shouldn't be allowed to do that, in my opinion, but either way, now we are going to be keeping this Dr. Octopus around, and my opponent doesn't actually get to add that much power to the ruined location. They're only beating us by 2, which means that we could still win that location later on. And I get a funny idea here to play Spider-Man, and that is going to lock my opponent out of the ruined location because it's full, and will also be able to lock my opponent out of one more location. And if you can only play to one location in the final turn, a location that you're already winning at, it's going to be tricky to win the game because we're only losing those other locations by a little bit of power, assumedly. my opponent's going to throw a Mr. Fantastic into Cloning Vat, so that will be a way they can add a little bit more power to Isle of Silence on the final turn, and that was part of the reason that I dropped Spider-Man into the center location. I thought that they would be more likely to play into the Cloning Vats, and I did guess correctly on that one. So my opponent doesn't really have too many options here, and here's the funny thing. We actually cannot win this game. There's no combination of cards that we can play that will beat a Mr. Fantastic into Cloning Vats, adding just 2 power to that location. We would also probably lose to a Silver Surfer, but my game plan from here is to just do nothing and hope that my opponent, with the idea that they're not going to be able to win 2 different locations, probably retreat. So we'll let my opponent defeat themselves here and retreat, and that is enough to take the win. Just thought that was a funny one. I don't often get to play with both Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus in the same deck, joining forces and locking my opponents out. Speaking of mind games, I thought that this game was also a lot of fun, and this one isn't actually going to feature Rickety Bridge. This one's going to have a totally different, powerful location that destroys a bunch of cards, Lamentis 1, which is just incredibly powerful, especially with Knull. Both of us have our entire decks destroyed. That skyrockets Knull up to 62 power. So I gotta snap. We've got a bunch of cool tools this game as well. We've got Ramp in the form of Wave, and we've got Galactus, and we can even go turn 4 Galactus and turn 5 Spider-Man, the location that we Galactus into, and that's obviously really good as well onto Rickety Bridge, because then Spider-Man will blow everything up and your opponent won't be able to play anything on the final turn, and they will be forced to retreat. So the only thing we've got to decide on this one is where we want to throw the G-Man. And I think about Daily Bugle, though ultimately I'm going to decide to play Galactus into Lamentis 1, where my opponent has their Zabu, so that way they're just going to have less space to be able to play cards, because Zabu's only 2 power, and this will just restrict their amount of cards that they can play. And we kind of guessed wrong, because, or my opponent guessed right, maybe you could put it, because they are able to play a She-Hulk into Lamentis 1, so they're feeling pretty confident, and they're actually going to wind up snapping. Now, I wind up playing Spider-Man and Death here, because I'm assuming the reason my opponent snaps is because they also have Spider-Man, and they're planning on locking us out of the featured location. They actually have Death from the Daily Bugle plus a Taskmaster, so they were going to lock themselves out of the featured location regardless, but we have Knull. We have a 61 power Knull, so I'm going to give my opponent an ARG emote, making them think that they've got the best of us, and then I realized that that might not be seen. I mean, we have to get my opponent to press play here. We don't want my opponent to retreat. So we don't want them thinking that I have Shang-Chi or Knull, which probably isn't on their radar, as a way to actually win this game. So what I'm actually going to wind up doing, and who knows how much this actually impacted the game, is I'm going to give my opponent an I am confident react emote in just a second, and the idea behind that was maybe they will interpret that as a bluff and then want to stay in it. So that was my thought process. I don't know how much it actually impacted the game here, but it does make my opponent press the end turn button, and we get to take them for the full 8 cubes. On turn 3, again, we're gonna find Rickety Bridge, so I'm gonna snap. We've got all of the tools that I just talked about in the last game. Turn 3 Wave, turn 4 Galactus onto Rickety Bridge, turn 5 Spider-Man, which blows up the bridge and locks my opponent out of the location. So pretty straightforward one, though it's not actually going to play out like that. My opponent is going to use a Juggernaut to knock Wave over onto the Rickety Bridge, which means now I can't play Galactus there on turn 4 because there's already a Wave there. So we've kind of got to go to the backup plan with Spider-Man and Galactus, which is actually really cool and should potentially be the main game plan. If we did the play that I was talking about earlier, your opponent only has one option. They're Spider-Man in the location, you're gonna play a card, it's the only location, they have to retreat. Though this game is a little bit more tricky and potentially allows you to get a few more cubes from your opponent. I'm gonna jump ahead. There's some other ways that this game could have gone, but how it winds up playing out is turn 5 Spider-Man onto Rickety Bridge, which already has something on it. And that's very important because that means that your opponent can't play to Rickety Bridge and you get to play a Galactus as your only card, destroying everything else. So even though my opponent is kicking my butt in the other two locations, and we could have potentially done something silly here in this game with Dr. Octopus onto the Rickety Bridge, powering up our Knull, and potentially found a way to win the differential. But instead, we're just going to drop the G-Man, not worry about the other crazy stuff that my opponent's got going on. They're Spider-Manning one location, and they're Iron Man onslaughting in Washington, D.C. So they had a really good lead in both of those locations, but those don't matter. All that matters is Galactus's Rickety Bridge. We're gonna blow up everything else, and I thought this was a really fun endgame screenshot as well, just with the Spider-Man webs there, and my opponent with absolutely no cards yet again. Here's a quickie. A turn 2 Psylocke into Sinister London allows me to play a turn 3 double Dr. Octopus, and that's going to lock my opponent out of playing to 2 different locations, which is enough for them to retreat. We even have some other toys that we can play with here. We've got Wave plus Galactus. Murder World is going to clear up, so we can throw our Galactus in that location and then finish off the game with an absolutely massive Knull. So we weren't even done yet, though my opponent is once we lock them out of both of these locations here. Here's another one without Rickety Bridge or Galactus, just using Dr. Octopus mainly to lock my opponent out of being able to play. We've got Elysium plus Wave to make Doc Ock a little bit cheaper, and then Cloning Vats will allow us to play a turn 3 Dr. Octopus and a turn 4 Dr. Octopus, locking my opponent out of 2 different locations. And then we've got some extra turns there with Limbo to just try to win those 2 that my opponent is locked out of. And my opponent gets a pretty big lead into the Cloning Vats with Arrow plus White Queen. By the way, that could steal anything from our hand because everything costs 3. And then Absorbing Man is just going to copy Arrow again. But we're only losing that location by 10. That is definitely still winnable. And the next thing we want to do is lock my opponent out of another location. So I'm going to drop Dr. Octopus either into Elysium or Limbo. Doesn't really matter. Ultimately going to decide to throw that into Limbo. And one thing I should mention is with Knull, one of the ways that I get power on that in games without Rickety Bridge is with Shang-Chi. You Dr. Octopus, bringing a bunch of cards out of your opponent's hand, like Magneto, and then you try to Shang-Chi them. Now here, we actually get Shang-Chi'd, but it's not really a problem. It makes our death cheaper, it makes our Knull bigger, and ultimately doesn't really impact our ability to add power to the board in the long run. My opponent also winds up waving, so I'm going to use that as an excuse now to drop my death into Cloning Vats, as well as drop my Knull there. That'll give us additional copies of both of those cards, and with the rest of our hand, I think we've got the tools to win this one. Next turn, we can play Spider-Man into Elysium, completely locking my opponent out of the final turn of the game, and then we can also Shang-Chi on that final turn to blow up my opponent's Magneto, which gives us a little bit more power in any of our Knulls that we wind up playing. So I'm going to wave again. That'll make death a little bit cheaper. It'll make everything a little bit cheaper, actually, in this Elysium Limbo game. And then I'm also going to Psylocke for just a little bit more ramp. And actually, my opponents had enough here, so they are going to retreat. One of the cool things about that game was that we didn't have Galactus or Rickety Bridge, so my opponent did not get to see the full power of this deck. And I actually wound up playing them right after that, and location number 1 was Rickety Bridge. So I figured we're gonna have a bunch of different fun ways that we can surprise my opponent. Now, they do know about the Dr. Octopus, they do know about the Knull, but they don't know about the Galactus. And Iceman actually winds up initially being huge here because that's going to delay my curve with Electro, but turn 2, I draw Psylocke, which is an amazing draw because now I'm still going to be able to run out that turn 3 Electro into turn 4 Dr. Octopus, and we can find some fun things to do from there. My opponent's also going to Scorpion us a little bit more disruption, but that's okay. We'll drop out the turn 3 Electro. They're going to play Colossus over onto the Rickety Bridge, which is fine. We're going to play Dr. Octopus over in that location, and we'll see what my opponent does on turn 4 here. They're going to play a Spider-Man over into Stark Tower, and then we're going to blow up everything on the Rickety Bridge, which is going to include an Arrow and an Absorbing Man, copying that Spider-Man and locking me out of Rickety Bridge, which is pretty annoying. If I can't play there on turn 5 and turn 6, or if I can't play there on turn 5, then I just can't do any cool setups with Galactus there. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to make use of the Rickety Bridge, but we do still have Galactus to totally surprise my opponent out of nowhere after that first game, and then we should be able to finish things off with a huge null and a death on that final turn, assuming we get to, actually no, we've got an extra energy from the Electro, so regardless, we'll be able to play null plus death on the final turn, so that's sweet. My opponent's going to snap, but we know they have no clue what's in store here. They're going to wind up actually playing out their death, give that a little bit more power on the Stark Tower, and they were probably feeling confident because of that. They could have moved the death into New York later if they decided that they wanted to, but now it's gone forever. And my opponent has a little bit of a power lead going into the final turn, but we just have way too much power in our deck. Death plus null on the final turn, that's even going to be leader here, so there's really nothing my opponent can do, and we get him for 8 cubes. This game was the biggest I was able to make null today, and you'll see why in just a second. My opponent and I are both snapping here, and this is going to be a double Dr. Octopus onto Rickety Bridge, because we're going to play Doc Ock, and we're going to drag out a Dr. Octopus from my opponent. So all that I want to make sure is that that doesn't grab my null, and it doesn't. So we're going to have an absolutely massive null at one of the other locations after this, because my opponent winds up having some really, really big cards in their hand that we drag out. We get their Magneto and their Giganto, as well as a Dracula, but that doesn't really add any power. They're a Lockjaw deck trying to cheat out some really big cards with Lockjaw and Dracula, and they do get some big cards. They're going to be able to win Asgard and kind of refill their hand a little bit, but we are going to have an absolutely massive null, and I did talk about this a little bit in, I think, the first game of the video. The goal here is to now tie Rickety Bridge, or we can potentially even win it with Bucky Barnes, and then just have a really big power lead with null that we can then take advantage of to win the differential and thus win the game. So plan here is to just go null into Asgard. I played it into Asgard thinking they were probably going to fill that location this turn, and they do. They drop a Vision there out of their Lockjaw. So they're actually not quite filling the location. So I predicted correctly, but my opponent is able to dodge us a little bit, but it shouldn't matter. We're probably going to win the Rickety Bridge, and maybe we'll tie it if my opponent also has a Bucky Barnes, but they can't like win it with Vision or something like that, because that will just blow up alongside the Bucky Barnes here. And we were also playing to win Monster Island, though we're really just winning on Asgard. We are going to see my opponent make a pretty cool play here, though, with Leader plus Wasp on the final turn. Morph isn't going to do too much for my opponent, but Bucky Barnes will tie them the Rickety Bridge, but a tie 6-6 is the same as a tie 0-0. Null can take it with the differential. This is just a cute interaction that I wanted to showcase. Spider-Man plus Starlight Citadel. When you Spider-Man, you are actually webbing the location, not the lane, which means when the location moves, so does the web. And that's going to allow us to, on turn 5, play Galactus into Fisk Tower, and my opponent is not allowed to. Now, this is kind of spoiled a little bit because my opponent has a Daredevil, so they get to see what's going on, but I still thought it was cute. I've been having a ton of fun with a bunch of crazy interactions in this deck. Probably still going to keep playing it for a few more hours before Rickety Bridge goes away, but for today, that's going to be it for me. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'm No Lex Given. Peace.